All right, sometimes when I'm sitting in my clay wine jar thinking my crazy thoughts, something comes by that I feel like I should just share with you. And what have I thought recently? I've thought that nonfiction is almost always preferable to fiction. Not only should you probably think about reading nonfiction books instead of fiction books, we should really have much more nonfiction movies, nonfiction television, nonfiction video games, even nonfiction music. This isn't to say that you can't or you shouldn't ever read fiction again, but on some level, nonfiction may be preferable to fiction. Now, ultimately, what I'm saying is that you have authors or directors or whoever who is making this media, and they have their own biases, they have their own misunderstandings of the world, they have their own perspective, which is limited. So they can never give you the real truth, even when they're writing something or conveying something fundamentally nonfiction. But if what they're doing is nonfiction, they can't help but at least include some things that are fundamentally true. If they're writing a story that is nonfiction about how this person interacted with this person and how that second person responded in anger when they heard something from the first person, that thing actually happened. That anger actually manifested in the world. They can't write it some other way if they know that's the way, or at least generally they won't. In a fiction story, they might write something that just is totally BS, but doesn't seem like it. They might say that a person, which in all accounts would be angry by something, they weren't angry. They accepted it, even if that's not possible for any human to be that way. Fundamentally, there is a core of truth if the story truly happened. Of course, it'll be distorted. Of course, they have their limited perspective. Of course, they have their misunderstandings of what truly happened. Even in an autobiography, you will fundamentally misunderstand or at least omit by the nature of you are simply one person. You can't understand everything. There will be distortions, but down deep, there will be a core of truth in nonfiction. But in a fiction story, it can be wholly fabricated, wholly fake, and a total lie that is not consistent with human nature, but instead just consistent with a delusion of the author, just consistent with their own prejudices, with their own narrow perspective, and their own misunderstandings, biases, and just general stupidity, even. This is why I'd say fundamentally, nonfiction is preferable to fiction. And again, you can read fiction. I'm not saying we should all abandon all fiction, but if you want a story of an underdog fighting a system that is against him, those things have actually happened. You don't need to rely on someone to make that story up for you. Have you heard the story of Longitude? There's been a number of stories written about him. John Harrison in England, they were attempting to find out how you could figure out longitude. And Sir Isaac Newton, one of the most intelligent people in the world, not just at that time, but who's ever existed, was in part charged with finding longitude and to judge the people who were trying to find longitude because there was a prize that was the equivalent of millions of dollars today. So if you could solve the problem of longitude, the crown would make you, basically in today's money, a millionaire. They would make you obscenely rich if you could do that. And John Harrison was a clockmaker. He made a clock or a watch that could do that. But Sir Isaac Newton didn't like the idea of this. He wanted to formulate this sort of way to calculate longitude through the position of the moon. He didn't want John Harrison to win that money, and Sir Isaac Newton had the power. So how did that story turn out of the little guy versus the entrenched power versus the old boys club or whatever? Well, why don't you read it? You could read a story where the author wants to make one of the characters die to pull at your heartstrings, so they might give the character a sympathetic name and set up a situation to really, get those tear ducts flowing. But if you were to read 2 Years Before the Mast, Richard Henry Dana recalled the day that George Bulmer died. And he didn't choose the name George Bulmer. That was George's real name. And he could have told us a story about how he saw George Bulmer fall from the mast and splash into the water and disappear into its depths, but he didn't, because that's not what really happened. He was below deck. He heard man overboard, rushed up on deck. He jumped in the quarter boat as it was being launched into the sea to go paddle and look for him. And he didn't even know who had gone overboard until he was in that quarter boat. He didn't even know whose life they were trying to save until he was already off the main boat onto the quarter boat and desperately paddling to look for this man. And he never saw him that day. There's no fake story about him seeing some hand sink below the water, because that's not how it really worked. How it really worked was not like dramatic and explosive, but just sad. And it was real. That man really died that day. Even if he were to have misremembered it slightly and told us slightly wrong, somewhere in that story is a kernel of truth and a real man dead. Every time we read these stories, every time we listen to these things, we watch these movies, I think it really does influence the way we imagine people, and we imagine the world, and we imagine organizations like the government. This is why it's so common to see people at protest referencing stories they've heard, whether they're fiction stories or nonfiction stories, and it's so pathetic to see these people with signs about Harry Potter during political protests. And it's so pathetic to see these losers talking about superhero movies during what should be normally serious conversations about real life, not their fantasies that they've received from some person who makes crap up.
In the context there and how legitimate the lethal threat is. I do believe that. I think that there's a lot of nuance there. But all I know is I've seen a lot of Marvel movies, and in the part where the good guy gets framed and he turns around and there are a bunch of angry cops and civilians staring at him, he drops the gun and puts his hand up in the air.
At the end of the day, you could choose to expose yourself to stories that, even though, yes, they're distorted, and yes, the authors were just humans and couldn't really give you the total truth, you could read stories that fundamentally somewhere have a kernel of truth. And if you read enough of these stories, you could start to understand the fundamental underlying principles of the world, of that kernel of truth, and not just the fundamental principles that underlie the biases of some author somewhere. So that's why I'd say nonfiction is preferable to fiction. And I think we should not just have nonfiction be popular in books, it should be popular in movies, television shows, video games, and even music.